so since I see some familiar faces, I can say this from this morning. Then the idea is that I probably return a little bit to what I said this morning and also for the discussion. Now, but the first repetition is the publiek's book, so the relational book that we are putting together to commemorate, because you can't say celebrate, to commemorate the 400 years of Dutch-Taiwan relations. Yeah, and this is in, oh yeah, I should pass it around. And yeah. And this publiek's book, which is a quasi-academic work of 25 chapters with each 2,000 words, no footnotes, but for the reference reading, is as I said, to commemorate the 400 years of Dutch-Taiwan relations covering the 17th century, so the VOC, but also contemporary, where the Netherlands and Taiwan have a close working cooperation in land and water management, like the dikes, the coastal, because the Netherlands is also very low. It's the lowlands, the low countries, and then also the TSMC, so the Dutch ASML, yeah, ASML, the Dutch semiconductor industry. Because it's not a coincidence that we do this together with the Technical University of Eindhoven, because Philips, the first semiconductor industry, is based in Eindhoven. And so we couple this, we attach this through a 3-day conference. The first day is the content of the book, and then we have the book launch with a couple of significant people from the business, the corporate world. And the second day, we have Taiwan and the world. So we have papers on Taiwan and Southeast Asia mainly, also relations with Japan. And the third day, then we return to the indigenous. And the afternoon, a student panel. Publications in book chapters and special journal issues are forthcoming, because they also have to include your presentation from August on the comfort women. Since we will have commemoration of the Second World War, the memory, how it is lived, the Japanese colonial occupation and colonial rule, occupation for Southeast Asia, how it is lived in Malaysia, Singapore, and then Taiwan, Korea, and Taiwan and Korea. We also have one American colleague from Rikyo University, who will look at the with the Japanese surrender. So the first couple of months, the antagonism and the tensions in Taiwanese and Koreans who were living in Japan, because Japan had to surrender, but you have these colonial subjects still living in Japan, having made their lives there. So, and then their relationship also towards Japan, towards United States, having their occupational powers in Japan. In Japan, we did not, and this will be for a follow-up, we include, and that's why we also have the conference there is a conference in July here, on the relations between Taiwan and Okinawa, which are increasingly coming into interest because of the more attention that is being paid to studying Taiwan in the 19th century. Now, but this is for the end of May and the beginning of June. For today's evening lecture, it ties in a little bit with what I discussed this morning on the Dutch, so for the newcomers in the class, in the lecture. What I did this morning, I introduced the Dutch sources, either in Dutch, but also in translation, translated into Mandarin and in English. and what are the major themes based on Taiwanese research translated into English, where we see women in the 17th century. Now, the focus of this one mainly is the relation between the Dutch and the indigenous women, whether they were the lowland indigenous or mainly the lowland indigenous, the Siraya, and how from my personal research currently, where I look at this set of primary source materials, because I can read the Dutch, I'm not dependent on a Chinese or an English translation. So I am returning to these sources, the published ones that they in print version, going through the index and seeing which are the key terms that refer to women, where we can find some information about girls, whether this is a marriage, whether this is the widow of a particular Dutch merchant. And this is then a smaller corpus research that I get afterwards, because the sources are now digitized. So I can use these keywords since an index is never complete. We always miss something. And as I gave the example this morning with the baby, was it the baby girl of 7 months being stillborn, but actually aborted, where also the term, the midwife, the vroedvrouw appeared. So vroedvrouw definitely is a term within the network of female gender of womanhood. So this is the next step. Once I have compiled kind of a little dictionary of key terms, I can apply this to the not only the daily journals, the dagregisters, but the missiva and the resolutions, and then hopefully something comes out of this. We have to stop worrying with working with big data. What will we find? We have to just go and do it. But for too many years, we have been wondering, like, and is it like ethical, and what will we find? And then we don't get anywhere, because we formulate and we keep running in one circle, talking about like what new will it give, and how can we justify the method of working. Okay, for today, yeah, I got so, but I don't need this, so I can close this.
Yeah, if it works.
I just
Yes.
so this one, yeah. So for today's class, initially it was the way around, but then I realized I already sent it and it was already printed. So we look at the gender and the race discourse within colonialism. And the main point is actually there how the Dutch dealt with this issue of race. Now, in 2020, Melissa Brown, and she wrote the work, Is Taiwan Chinese? I think it's Taiwan Chinese, yeah, on Chinese identity. And she looked at the indigenous, and she picked up her old research, and she published this article in the East Asian History and Culture Review. And I think this is in Harvard Journal, but it's a fairly new one, because this is only volume 9. So what she did, she looked at, as it says here, the title, Taiwan's intersectional, I can read it here too, intersectional cosmopolitanism, local women in their communities. It consists of 3 parts, 17th century, 19th century, and contemporary, with the factory workers. And the whole way through, she pays attention to the indigenous and the Pingpu, or the lowland Aborigines. Now, this is a very interesting article for sure, but I will not repeat everything she says. I will actually put what she writes and how she contextualizes the 17th century from the perspective of the Dutch sources. Yeah, so, and this then ties in with the topic. These are some of the works that she also consulted and that we all consult when we work on the 17th century, and since it's about women, the position of women, Austronesian women, so definitely there is the inips, the priestesses, and the compulsory, the mandatory abortion. Then in English, there is the work by William Campbell, the English missionary, who compiled and collected a number of sources on the Dutch in the 17th century, including the short discourse that I mentioned this morning about the lifestyles and the habits and the customs of the Siraya that the Dutch encountered. Then the work to the right is the Sinkan Wenshu. These are the land deeds that continue to be used in between indigenous and Han Chinese as mortgage sales contracts. And thanks to these land deeds, the Siraya language has entered the period of revitalization. But I must add to this that it's still a dormant language. Then the Formosan encounter, which has the English translations of relations, mainly Dutch and indigenous, taken from the three types of preserved materials, the daily journals, the resolutions, and the missiva. Translation of the daily journals, the Zeelandia, the dagregisters van Rulandia, Zeelandia Castle, the missiven here, this is one of the Chinese translations, still ongoing, and then also the work by Cho Xing-hui, who looks at the agency of the indigenous during the Dutch period. So the Dutch period is one of the terminology we often use, we talk about Dutch Formosa and Spanish Hermosa. And the colonial civilizing process, the civilizing, of course, from the perspective of the Dutch as colonial rule and how the indigenous took their agency. So these are some of the works that also Melissa Brown used and to which we have access if we want to talk and write about women in the 17th century. Then she gives a little bit more. I can add this article. All these have scholars have written about how cosmopolitan the Taiwan was during the 17th century, thanks to the Dutch, and how it kind of waned when Chinese following consecutive Chinese rule entered. But she wants to make a point here. And she says, look, Andrade, so Antonio Andrade, whose work is often cited because his work is Taiwan Chinese, because he's based at the United States, so a lot of the scholarship in Taiwan is very much driven from United States. So he gets a mention all the time. So is Melissa Brown. He consistently ignores women's contributions in his analysis of Taiwan historical plurality. So reason for her to start paying attention to the women. Yeah. Okay, so her starting point, she says indigenous contributions of the women, of the local women, and also the Panti, which then are the Han women or those who intermarried with Han, remained in Taiwan, are widely accepted. So we all know this, it's mentioned, but specifically their roles in their contributions, she says they are still largely overlooked. And her point in this article is that Austronesian women, they facilitated the sociality across diversity between the Han, the indigenous, the Dutch, some of the Japanese and occasional Spanish that got lost, that made Taiwan cosmopolitan under 17th century Dutch colonialism. And then she works really with this concept of cosmopolitanism, and cosmopolitanism she attributes, she says, in order to be cosmopolitan, it comes from the tradition of literacy You needed to be literate to be part in the cosmopolitan world. And that's why in her article, she refers often to education. Now, I steer a little bit away from this. Yeah, I'll steer away from going the line of cosmopolitanism and the literacy. And rather, I want to talk more about what were the incentives for the Dutch and what was the reality of the Dutch and why did they, what were from the Dutch company perspective, the contributions of the indigenous women. Not only by teaching them how to read and write in education, which in itself had a particular reason. So indigenous women's public visibility laid the social and cultural foundation for later generations of women to work in public. And this she pulls all the way through the Japanese period and then contemporary Taiwan, the 60s and the 70s. But they made essential contributions too, and there we go, the term interethnic cooperation. Okay, so about indigenous women. And these are some of the elements I have taken from her article, which I then afterwards will contrast or put in the context on the Dutch incentives of coming to the Far East. So the missionaries convert the Austronesians. She still refers to Austronesians. Now we have to talk about indigenous with a capital I. To Christianity, overthrowing the indigenous women-led religious practices. I mentioned that this morning, the priestesses who had position in society. We can't have this because we come here. We need to establish a Calvinist community where Christianity and especially in the beginning, Calvinism was rather strict because they had people to kind of obey, and you couldn't just go to church. You had to, there was the censura morum, which means whenever the mass was organized, then before the clergy, so the reverend, the minister with some of his scribes, knocked on the doors and asked if you had been behaving. And of course, they knocked also on your neighbor's door, because then the neighbor could tell you, yeah, actually, my neighbor has not been behaving. He was running around drunk and swearing at my wife. And then, of course, this meant that you had been sinning. So you then had to do a couple of prayers. Only then you could come to Mass. So this is actually the content from the church minutes, which is one of the sources that is, and that I have been recently working with, that is currently available. And we're working on the translation. I will publish that this year, the beginning of next year, the latest. Yeah. So the in converting the Austronesians, the indigenous to Christianity, a faster way was basically slaughtering and killing all the priestesses, which was also happening. Then you could kind of implement your own religious faith. Yeah. So what it did, it also pushed the newlyweds to settle in their own home, and they start raising children immediately. So hand women were rare, and this was one of the questions asked this morning. She says here, certainly less than 10% of the population. I wonder if it were that many. And European women were even rarer. Yet Dutch sources report that many Han and European men married and had families. And that's what I'll get into later. Women were important members of the Siraya communities in their own right, because it was a matrilineal society, which meant, and this is significant, the Siraya women owned the agricultural fields. Because matrilineal, so inheritance goes over via the woman, not the husband. Siraya women chose their own husbands, and this apparently shocked both the Dutch and the Chinese afterwards with their willingness to engage in sexual activity, whether married or not. And then in the discourse over the course or the short story, the ethnographic account by Candidius, he does spend a lot of time actually about the social relations between man and wife, and whereas it was not the also for the Chinese, this was surprisingly, it were not the women moving into the household of the men, but it was the way around. So this is all very interesting to read. Austronesians women local agricultural expertise and their kin networks, because it was a matrilineal society, probably were viewed positively by Han men seeking marriage partners. But we have to keep in mind that Chinese men, migrant labor, they came to work in Taiwan for a number of years and then they returned. So they did take sexual partners in Taiwan, but they all had a family back home. It was afterwards, because afterwards when Dutch no longer in Taiwan, dependency of a Fujian province until it became a full-fledged province in the 1885, that you see this migration from the two coastal provinces, Fujian and Guangdong, to Taiwan in the beginning with quotas, also quotas for Hakka, quotas for the Min, from mainly the Fujian population or the Hokkien, the Holo. But these quotas were like released and put in, I mean, they were varied. And from the beginning of the 19th century kind of really disappeared, which did not exclude that there was a lot of illegal migration too. The Austronesian women presence, in public visible spaces was striking to 17th century Chinese observers, because you did not take your wife for a walk, especially not when she had bound feet. So, okay, Chinese tradition in itself was not used to having the women perform in group, in public, the dancing, the singing, as the indigenous are often being referred to in Taiwan, and they joke themselves about doing so. So actually, this all goes back very, very long time ago, these stereotypes that were kind of established then and continue to live on. Because it's like, the indigenous in Taiwan, they sing and dance, and when you talk to indigenous and you want to organize, you say, well, let's come and sing and dance, we can do this. That's what we are good at. Okay, it's like taking the piece of themselves, joking with themselves, but at the same time, it's like this little angle to sting at Taiwanese society. Bon. So the Han and the European men who married Austronesian women, and this is the point that Elisa wants to make with her cosmopolitanism, enhanced bilingualism for husband and wife and for the children. But as I said this morning, one of the reasons was the implementation of the Dutch language, because the bilingualism also includes the Dutch language, was so that the church could keep control, and that Dutch language was being used, because from Batavia there was the fear that the house slaves were raising the kids speaking either Malay or Portuguese. And this was not tolerable to the Dutch. I mean, they already are taking peace with the fact that they were not going to establish an entirely, I have to repeat myself now, an entirely white Christian community with white men and white women. But in order to survive and get the trade that they were the reason for coming there, they had to be inclusive to the local society. They also had in Batavia the competition with the Portuguese, because the Portuguese were in Southeast Asia before the Dutch. That was one of the main reasons why the Dutch and also the English went all the way to the Far East in order to beat the monopoly that the Spanish and the Portuguese had on the spice trade in Europe. And Portuguese are Catholic. And Calvinism, it's always when you set up, when you want to establish something, you have to work by the rule, by the letter of the book. So Calvinism was fairly strict. For instance, the weddings, no singing, no dancing. But this absolutely was not a problem for the Catholics. So in order to establish a Christian community, a Calvinist community, they were fairly strict, but not everybody was being so happy with being strict and not being able to walk the rank on the street. To give an example, so they started to lose, actually, and this is in Batavia, they started to lose Dutch membership from the church, going clandestinely to the Catholic Church. No, we can't have this. Catholic Church was also used Portuguese. They also used the Portuguese, the intermarriages that the Portuguese also based their rule on with the local people, and where then Portuguese and Malay, those two languages were at the same time also lingua franca, also for the Dutch in Taiwan and dealing with the Chinese. So it was not always was it Mandarin? There was interpretation and this is probably going to be partly must have been also Cantonese. This is an interesting part in which language precisely they were communicating, but definitely Southern Min was involved. So Minan, where you had then the translation being done via Malay into Dutch, and from Dutch via Malay or Portuguese into Chinese. That's the role of the interpreters. The interpreters, they have extra access, so they are also becoming very important in briefing over particular information. Okay, so here on the language policy, out of fear that the Dutch administration was losing ground in promoting their language, they changed the rules. New decree from 1642, they decided this in 41, but it came through in 1642. All the documentation, a copy has to be sent to Batavia and change the religious instruction using Dutch. And significantly for the Dutchmen who had relations with indigenous women, if you married, the wife also had to show the beginnings, had to be able to speak Dutch. There comes why instruction in Dutch. Good, but this network of marital ties had implications for access to resources and implementation of policies. And I just mentioned already one policy implementation, but it goes beyond that. Many Chinese middlemen, they had indigenous and then plain Aborigines wives, because the indigenous living on the plains, they intermarried and they then gained the name Pingpu. They were also not the raw, but the cooked barbarians. And this is a terminology that took place. There was a Chinese terminology going back a long time, actually, and stayed in vogue all the way throughout the Qing. It was with the establishment of the Republic in 1911, when we are no longer going to use feudalism. We are now a republic, that we cannot keep calling the indigenous people barbarians, fun. And then a new term comes. By then, Taiwan was a Japanese colony. So, but that's a different story. The history of the name giving of the indigenous from Fan, Shu Fang and Shen Fang, raw and cooked barbarian, depending on whether they were living in the mountains and being headhunters and having contact with the Chinese, and those who were in the middle, those who lived on the plains. and did the trade between the Chinese and the mountain indigenous. So, and now it's all Yuanzumin. But the term Yuanzumin, originally used by the Japanese, did not become a term in Taiwan until the mid-1980s, when some of the indigenous students at Taidas established a newsletter and said we are not the Shampao, like the mountain compatriots, because not being based in the center of Beijing, but we are all brothers and sisters under the four seas. We have the Tongpao, the Tongpao and the Shampao were the terminology that KMT officials used after a lot of debate for the indigenous. But then you had the Kaoshanpao, the Kaoshan from the high mountain, and this is currently still the term used for the indigenous in the Shaozu Minzu, in the PRC, how they refer to the Taiwanese indigenous. But that's a whole different story. That's a whole different lecture too. Batavia decided we have to, the VOC headquarters, that means Batavia, they ordered to remove the Han men, the Chinese men, could no longer stay in the indigenous villages. And this is very much related to the pragmatism. I'm running ahead now. The pragmatism that is one of the specificities of Dutch colonial rule. As long as it is to our benefit, we can be tolerant, yeah. When it's not, we can be extreme. And that's where the pragmatism works in the realization we won't be able to have this white community here. We have to be inclusive. So if it is to our advantage that we work together with the local community, the local tribe, even when their women are empowered, it's fine for us, because it's win-win situation. In case we feel that the environment or the tribe or the community or the area where we come and plant ourselves are not to our advantage or threatening what we consider hegemony or a heterogeneous community, we just slaughter them. Slaughter is not the right word, but it's basically killing them all, which they actually did in 1741. I mean, I'm jumping ahead a century, in Batavia with the Chinese community, because they felt the Chinese were not responding or interfering with particular policies that the Dutch implemented. Don't ask me these policies because I've been thinking about it and I can't remember. But the work by Leonard Blusset talks about this. Good, so they decide, fine, pragmatism good, but we have to separate these Chinese men from these indigenous villages, because they were starting to see the intermarriages between the Chinese men and the indigenous women. And I'll come back to this. They ignore it. They say, no, we're not listening to what Batavia is saying here. And the argument they use is, they say, because we need to have these Chinese there, because the Chinese were also catching the deer and bringing in revenue. So this was used as a reason why they ignored the separation between Chinese men in indigenous villages. But Batavia would not have it. And apparently they had to implement this rule of separation. And then they solved this with taxation. If you wanted to stay as a Chinese, we're going to tax you more. So what you do as a Chinese, you move. Good. The leverage, yeah. So these are a few other things that Melissa says. This is one of the woodblock print from 1717, so it's a little bit later. So the singing and the dancing in public, the indigenous women's practices must have kind of disturbed Dutch and Han gendered notions, and the disempowering of the Siraya women who were the religious leaders, also the proportion of Han men when the population grew, and especially afterwards kind of declined, or was the reason why the status of women declined towards the end of the Dutch period and afterwards. But yeah, I'd like to look with part of what I mentioned this morning. How can we look at the Dutch male perspective from a different angle? And let's then think back of society in 17th century Taiwan. That's why I have a Rembrandt here. And it's a 17th century one, 1662. So 17th century is known as the age of commerce. And this is not because of the matrilineal they encountered in Taiwan. No, it's also the age of the matriarch. And in the early modern Netherlands, we see that women were allowed in the commercial sphere. This also explains, and this is probably why Melissa Brown is coming up with this literacy, this also explains why the Netherlands was one of the forerunners in literacy. And one significant element is also because of the vernacularization and no longer teaching in Latin, but we teaching the church. A lot of religion comes in the language that we speak, so in Dutch. Now, when the Dutch arrive, it takes them a year, they come to Batavia, Southeast Asia. They realize that the role of the women in Southeast Asia was very important. They were actually at the center. This is an observation they made, and from which they learn. And they also learn from the Portuguese, because the Portuguese did the same. So instead, so we already have one point. Women in the Netherlands entered the commercial sphere because the Netherlands had a population growth. You also see in the Netherlands that one of the reasons for taking these voyages was because of the beginning change. I have written that here because certain things I cannot keep remembering. I have to write down until I have practiced them over and over again. Yeah. Yeah, because the 17th century, since I don't come from European history, that's, so with the, like, okay, the VOC, that's where I start. It was the world's largest employer in the early modern period, about like 1,970,000 something personnel. They sailed to Asia between 1602 and 1790s. Okay, that's a fair number. Why? Why would you want to leave your hometown and take a one-year voyage with only 50% chance to survive, and then yet another 50% chance to survive in the tropics where there is malaria? First, the Low Countries, they had a downturn in arable land. You had a growth of cities, urban centers, over-exploitation of land, yes. And you had a shift toward a less labor-intensive livestock, so peasant life, farmer's life. And this freed up that you have a number of Dutch workers who have no opportunity for work anymore in the countryside, and they go to the cities. and the cities are growing, but they cannot absorb all of them. So you have poverty, you have people you have unemployment. And there, the golden age, as the Netherlands call it, the opportunity to go to the Indies, to go get your riches there, became attractive to a fair number of these Dutch men. Yeah. Okay. So these Dutch men arrive, they survive the 1-year ship voyage. They arrived there, and very few women came. So it was not advisable. It was simply not really the role of European women to go. So in order to survive and have their trade chances, they didn't try to change the gender roles, but instead they adopted and this is called the women in the marketplace. It was not entirely new to them, because in the Netherlands itself, women were entering the commercial sphere. They realize in Asia, they come to, they have Java, they have Sumatra. They also see this in Taiwan with the indigenous. It's the indigenous woman who owns the land. It's not her brother, yeah? So, the women in the marketplace, that's the model. And that's what they used throughout the 17th and the 18th centuries. It's from the 19th century that actually the purity of race becomes more important, which is also linked to this, yeah. Okay, pragmatism in the pursuit of profits was at the heart of the VOC activities. And then I have the voyage, a bit compressed. Then I have the Bible. This is a translation of the Gospel of Matthew in Siraya, in one of the local languages that they also instructed. And this is, of course, the trade with the indigenous. And then above we have the VOC coin, the V, the O, the V for United, Vereenigde, the O for Oost-India, East Indies, and C for Company. And the date, it's an 18th century coin. So pragmatism, I already mentioned. Decisions, including legal decisions, were made to enhance the profitability. Pragmatism is the most important explanatory key to VOC colonial behavior. When being tolerant, let's marry the local women paid, the VOC practiced it, and when it did not, prejudice became very extreme. Yeah, men cannot exist without women. This was one of the sayings of one of the founders at the VOC, Batavia's founder, Jan Pieterszoon Koen. So initially he said, okay, we have a trading base. We come here to trade, to get these spices, be in competition with the Spanish and the Portuguese. But we also want to be a settler community. Soldiers, they came alone. Settlers, here it says, they often brought wives and families, but that became rather gradually. But the transportation of European women to Asia remained exceptional. Yeah, what were some of the realities? Demographic and economic realities, mortality rates, 5 times higher than in Europe, because these are the explanatory factors why they've become inclusive to allowing intermarriage with local women, which also affects and gives the higher status to the indigenous woman. Higher status meaning on the same level as the European women. So to survive Batavia, you had to endure a decade of repeat exposures to malaria, dangerous sicknesses, dysentery, and that is also mentioned in as one of the keywords, typhus. Children who survived malaria were immune. a local woman into adulthood, was immune, but her newcomer, Reed, Dutch white husband, this was the same Taiwan, Batavia alike, had 50 chance to die. And for her, she also has 50% chance she became a widow. Now, if she became a widow, she would inherit Dutch man, her husband's property, even if it was only a trunk with some clothes in, or a silver goblet. So, and this becomes the reasoning why for the VOC to start including the local wives on the same level as the company law. So first, intermarriage enters colonial rule and law, but gradually, because men cannot exist without women. So Kuhn, in 1619, he cited, he used the argument to the gentleman 17, which is the real headquarters, not in Batavia, but in the Netherlands, who were the board of directors of the United East India Company. He writes to them and he says, okay, fine, actually, it would be better if we have a settler community rather than all these soldiers. So it's a high cost of keeping a garrison. We need women. That's what he says. Men cannot exist without women. We need women. So his request is honored, and the VOs and a shipload of women is being sent out to Batavia, but it were prostitutes. There's nothing wrong with prostitutes, but it's a job. It's what you do. So these girls arrive, no words about their age. These girls arrive in Batavia, and of course they act like sex workers. Oh, we can't have this. This is so shameful. Because we are here, we are Dutch, we are the white man, you know, we act as if this is our place, and then we have these women behaving so shamefully. We lose so much face, you know, to use the terminology, in front of local society. So we can't have this. The shipload of prostitutes were sent back. But it didn't solve the problem. So all kinds of, and there we go, forms of illicit sex emerged to fill the void. And it was not only among the soldier, it was also among the highest, so all men, men of all ranks. And the higher the rank, the less they worried about paying a fine. Yeah, paying a fine. Right, I have now, one moment, I need to search the edicts. Yeah. Because we don't have to think far to realize that living in sin, so having a relationship with a couple of other local women, concubinage, was punished by edicts. So you could not have. So concubinage was punished, but the company men, concubinage is one of these forms of illicit sex, but the company men, they remained indifferent. So in 1622, Batavia, this is still Batavia, establishes a law that marked the criminalization of concubinage together with adultery and incest. And that's also why we have these terms like adultery and incest as one of the key terms in the index, because these are terms that also in the legal documentation appear. And they were named under the larger umbrella of sexual deviance. But there was a difference. There was a difference in the punishment and also in the court, which dealt with the punishment, which sentenced the punishment between these acts of sexual deviance and infidelity, if it happened between two people who shared the same faith, or if it happened with a Christian, with somebody who was of another faith, call it a heathen, call it a Muslim, call it and so the punishments for the infidelity between two Christians, let's say the Dutch surgeon with the indigenous wife of the fiscal, who, because she was married to a Dutchman, she had to be baptized. That was punishment. Punishment for both, because the indigenous woman was family member, so she was part of the company. In case her Dutch husband, the fiscal, came to die because he caught malaria or he broke his leg and it became infected and he passed away, then she would inherit. She became a widow. Now, if he was the fiscal or the surgeon, he had call it a silver knife, a silver, this was property. She then became attractive to both another Dutchman, who also may have some property. Suppose he passed away, she inherited the second time. So in order to keep this Dutch property within the company, she was given the same rights as the Dutch wife. So it's all in the name of pragmatism and profit, not only getting some more spices, but also keeping the profit indoors. Also, in case she became a widow, but and this was the case in Taiwan, but she was interested, or some Han Chinese who was not too poor, showed interest in her, but she could give the trunk, the nice Dutch trunk with maybe the silver goblet to the Han Chinese. And then the Dutch would lose, so property would be lost. And that was the underlying reason why from Batavia, they said, okay, Chinese men and indigenous separate, because it was actually to keep the indigenous women part, the Chinese of the Dutch community, attached to the Dutch community, and not run away to the Chinese men. Now, if it was the case that the Dutch surgeon was having a one-night stand with with an indigenous friend of the house slave, who was not baptized, and they were caught, she was killed. She was sentenced because she was not part of the company, of the VOC. So just to give an example of this pragmatism, to what extremes it went. As it was for the own kind, fine, we can be mild. From the moment you are not part of the company and it had nothing to do with race, it could be an English, it could be a Spanish, it could be a Chinese, it could be a Japanese, could be an indigenous. As long as they were not employed by the company and part of the company, they were sentenced, they were tried, there a different set of laws was put in rule for them. So that explains, that says why the discourse of race and gender during the Dutch was not based on race, but it was based on the discrimination, the discrimination was not on the basis of race, because you are indigenous, you are Indonesian. No, it was based on the employment. If you did not have an employment with the company, with the VOC, because they were called the company, it doesn't matter whether you were a Japanese businessman or you were a Chinese prince, so to speak, or a slave, no difference. You were tried differently, because at the same time, it also worked in terms of the competition that the Dutch had with the English coming, with the Spanish, with the Portuguese being there. So of course you give them a much harsher punishment than for your own kind. So these are some of the examples that no matter how interesting Melissa Brown's article is, but this is the background. She doesn't approach this from the wider, the global, puts it in a global setting. Yeah. So interracing, and I think I'm coming to the end now. Interracial mixing between European and Asians due to a lack of European females pushed company officials, colonial officials, to choose a legal system that discriminated based on VOC employment and connection rather than race, which is in my understanding and what I know about the 17th century was kind of an insight, because we tend to talk about colonialism based and also identity politics, making the separation with race. The racial purity did come in the 19th century, because then you see more European women actually coming to the Far East, and they didn't like the way their men were having relations with the local women. Yeah. So decisions, including legal decisions, were made to enhance the profitability, recognizing marriages. So as long as, for instance, the governor general and the merchant and the fiscal and the surgeon, men cannot exist without women. So now they say they have their, they have their needs. They were having their relations with their slaves. Okay, fine. Allow the slave girl to become the wife, because 50% chance is that she inherits, that she survives, and then we don't want the property to be lost. So let's be tolerant. So colonial law, the second point, made the distinction, and that's where it grants the Asian women Dutch legal status. The distinction between company versus non-company, and not, and that's where the race element doesn't work, not European versus Asian. It's, are you employed by the VOC company or not? As the primary legal distinction. Primary legal distinction, the Raad van Justitie, the Court of Justice, was for the VOC employees, their families and slaves. And another set of courts, and that's then the Schepenbank, or the court, sorry, not the court, of alderman for everyone else. Yeah. So company versus non-company implicates the other. And for instance, the English as a competitor had to be treated outside of Dutch law, which was much harsher. So in short, the system would not discriminate against the wives and the sexual partners of VOC personnel. Company personnel and wives and slaves were one group, whereas the European colonists, the free indigenous, the foreign orientals, and the slaves were a different group and tried differently. Yeah. And then another one of a concluding sentence, Asian women and mestizo society, which they took from the Portuguese, became the center of the political and the social world of, this is Batavia, a political center because enterprising men sought out rich widows and promoted through female lines. And a social center because men died and women brought up their children as Asians. Okay, this can be further discussed, and I'll have to work a little bit more on that one. So, and then we can to assess, it's not access, but assess back to the sentence, where in 42, Batavia headquarters decided Chinese men to be separated from indigenous villages. But the Taiwan factory, I explained this morning what the Taiwan factory is, ignores this. Why? Precisely, the Dutch administrators and the Han men living in the villages were married into the same matrilineal Austronesian network. They knew about this, but they were not particularly keen on telling their superiors in Batavia. Now, one of the reflections, and then we have to actually come back to the important role of Christianity, where it was also to the interest of the Dutch, of the VOC in Taiwan, that Chinese men living with, and here living with Christian women, and these Christian women were definitely not Dutch women. These were most likely also could have been widows, baptized girls through education. They wished that at least they be instructed and become Christians, because this way, by separating them, they missed out, first of all, less control, and they missed out on growing the Christian, the Calvinist community. And secondly, and then we come to the children, that the children would remain with the mothers to prevent them turning into heathens. Sure, because the Chinese men may also die, and then the indigenous woman would be there with the child, and the child would inherit, and the child would also be Christian, so it would also be part of the company. So these were some of the reasons why they were not particularly keen in Taiwan to separate the Chinese men from the indigenous women. On the one hand, yes, and on the other hand, there was the fear, and that was the fear that Batavia instilled with these intermarriages, that the local women would run away with the indigenous women, would prefer a Chinese man over a Dutch man. So I want to finish here. This is food for thought. These are some of the schooling elements. I'd like to finish here with the sentence, but now by looking at Astrid, I forgot the sentence, what I want to say. It will come back to me. Why precisely I ended up with this one sentence. I know again. Because this morning I explained, so we have the daily journals. This citation, this passage comes out of the church minutes. So the meetings of the clergy, so if the women had been behaving and the men had been running around and so on. Now, the decision, the legal decisions that the Chinese men had to be removed from the indigenous village must have been put down in a resolution. And the resolutions were the decisions being made between the governors. Now, there are also the missiva. And the missiva is the correspondence from the governor in Taiwan to the one in Batavia and vice versa. And the comparison, when you put the resolutions, this is the policy making, and the missive is how they implement the policy making. So it's actually in this context here, and this is what, I mean, the article by Melissa also has not been doing, to start looking into to what extent were these, so is the policy of the Dutch administrators and the decision being made not to separate the Han Chinese men from the indigenous, is that a resolution? And where do we find information on the missive, whether it's followed up, yes or no? And this has not been done. So that is kind of one of the tasks I could better look into. To what extent this, and now I finished, to what extent the decision to separate the communities, where is the element of pragmatism in there from the side of Batavia, and how it was implemented in Taiwan and resonated, could accommodate the situation in Taiwan, which also had a matrilineal society where the indigenous woman was more powerful than, let's say, her brother, and became not only attractive to Dutchmen, but also to Chinese men. Yeah. So is that enough reason for the Dutch to separate them? Yes, and on the other hand, no. Because by keeping an eye on them, they could also control not only the taxation, but also the interwarfare that also existed among the indigenous communities. And that's then what some refer to as the co-colonization, but I don't want to go into that one. The interaction between the three ethnicities, the three groups, because my presentation here was about the representation of women in 17th century Taiwan. So I hope for the three of you who were here this morning that it kind of elaborated a little bit on what I said this morning. Yeah, because it's actually one big presentation cut up into parts. I'd like to finish on this note. Thank you very much.